You argue in the cover story this week in the New Statesman that there has been a revolution within Labour. What do you mean?
Counter-revolution, I would say, probably. And we called it a reformation as well, because it's really looking at the Reform Party. So I think, we're living in this new world and we don't actually have the political language for it. I think we're going to have to find new political language for these times. But it's a world in which there has been a huge conservative small c, but also big C, but mainly small c, revolution going on around the world, emanating from America in all directions. And it covers everything from net zero to migration to gender issues, all of that. This huge conservative revolution. And Britain is in a very unusual position because as it happens, we have a Labour government. Now, this has never happened before. And this gives Keir Starmer and the people around him a whole series of really hard choices. And my column is really about those choices, because if you look at a range of stories, and they run from the Rosebank oil field in the North Sea and the decision looming on that, about which the New Statesman has written extensively, right the way through to the treatment of gender issues in universities, to a new migration strategy and those videos going out about people being shackled and deported. Right across the piece, you see a series of individual stories. Put them all together, and what you see is a very, very unusual thing, which is a kind of handbrake turn by a government in the middle of governing, changing direction. And I think it is changing. You talk about blue Labour. It is changing in a kind of blue Labour direction. But what I mean by that is an absolute primary focus on poorer and middle-class white voters who have felt excluded by metropolitan political life for a very long time and are in revolt, and it's trying to answer their problems in a way that many people will see as quite conservative.
But how much of a radical shift is it? Because, yes, you mentioned the videos of migrants being deported this week, and some people in the Labour Party really didn't like that at all. But during the election campaign, we did have Keir Starmer talking about immigration. He knew that it's something he had to tackle. He's toughened up the language. Is it really a radical shift?
Yes, it is a radical shift, because it's not just the videos. If you look at the new advice that's gone out to Home Office officials dealing with migrants, the advice now is that anybody who comes here illegally, anyone who comes here by a dangerous route, will never get British citizenship, will never get a British passport. And as the Labour MP Stella Creasy pointed out yesterday, that means Paddington wouldn't have got a passport. This is going to go quite deep into the Labour Party's instincts.
Not sure that's a terribly strong argument. A fictitious bear from Peru.
Well, it's the best I could manage early on a cold morning. But
it's not yours. It's her argument. I'm not sure.
Nevertheless, I think that, one of the many ironies here is that this is very much aimed, the new mood is very much aimed at an excessively legalist, progressive world mindset, the so-called North London lawyer mindset. And who is the ultimate North London lawyer? It is, of course, the Prime Minister. And he's seen his best mate, Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, under ferocious attack from all sides over issues around migration, but also, of course, the Chagos Islands issue we've talked about before. And so he must be looking in the mirror thinking, who am I really?
Do you think, talking about Richard Hermer, the Attorney General there, Rachel, our colleague, wrote yesterday after PMQs that he does now appear to be the Prime Minister's biggest weakness. Of course, we had Lord Glassman, Maurice Glassman, speak to George earlier in the week, who called him a progressive fool and that he had to go. Do you agree that this is now a problem?
Yeah, I do. I do think also that the Prime Minister is a man of some sort of stubbornness about these things. And the fact that the Tories are going for Hermer again and again and again in the short term might make him safer, actually. Because he won't want to give something to Kemi Badenoch. He's crushing Kemi Badenoch week after week in Prime Minister's questions. He won't want to give her a win like that if he possibly can avoid it.
I think even GB News gave him 6-0 yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually horrible to watch. I don't often say this, I felt very sorry for Kemi Badenoch. It is a kind of boiling cauldron, Prime Minister's questions, and she's being boiled alive.
If you're enjoying our videos, sign up for our free daily politics newsletter, Morning Call. Get fresh reporting and analysis from George Eaton, Rachel Cunliffe and more direct to your inbox every weekday morning. Morning Call is completely free and you can sign up at the link in the description below. The I newspaper today also names 2 others alongside Hermer as they think could go in a reshuffle. They put Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson in there, and also the Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy. I know in your column you talk about education a bit, and we've touched on it yesterday in the podcast. I went to meet Catherine Birbalsingh, who's a vocal critic of the Children's Wellbeing in Schools bill. Do you think Phillipson could be vulnerable?
I think everybody is a bit vulnerable at the moment. I think we are heading for an enormous political crash in the spring around spending, when the departments learn that there may be yet more cuts. And I think everybody's angry. Everybody's on tenterhooks about that. I think the interesting thing about Bridget Phillipson is that she has been seen all the way through as one of the genuine rising stars, coming from outside the normal political class, a fresh and unusual voice. But I think Number 10 are concerned about aspects of the children's schools and wellbeing bill going through, the education bill, because nobody, it appears, quite expected this to be full frontal against the academy freedoms, against the freedoms on who they hired and on pay and on the ability to which they have to diverge from the national curriculum. And these are seen in Number 10 as things that were championed rather successfully by Michael Gove in the Tory years, but beyond that by Tony Blair in the New Labour years. And one person said to me, when did this bill become the rolling back, not just of Gove, but of Tony Blair? We didn't see this coming. Now, Bridget Phillipson would say, well, you should have seen it coming. I did tell you all. But there's no doubt that if there is a big tension inside the government, and there is, between, as it were, traditional progressive Labourism, which is what she represents, and a much harder-edged, more confrontational view of reform, which, for instance, where Streeting might represent, then Number 10 are much more in the second bit rather than the first.
I should add also that with the academies, there are people within who are close to Phillipson who would say, look, there are failing academy schools. They're not like this magic bullet, but there is a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of opposition to the bill for sure. You also say in your column, I guess it's the flip side of reshuffling, is you say we surely must be close to ministerial resignations. Do you see that this kind of slightly more small c conservative move of Labour is actually going to alienate others who will say, look, that's not what I signed up for?
It alienates backbenchers and it alienates some ministers as well. So if we look at Ed Miliband, right, here is somebody who's a very close, very long-standing ally of Keir Starmer, neighbour and all the rest of it, and whose green industrial strategy is the industrial strategy this government has. A very big thing to try and throw overboard. I think there's no chance at all of Keir Starmer sacking him. But I wonder about Ed Miliband's own view of his position, because he's had to accept a radical downgrading of the amount of money, capital spending for his green industrial strategy. He's then had to swallow the third runway at Heathrow, and he may have to swallow a reversal of the government's position on the Rosebank oil field, which he has called himself vandalism, economic and environmental vandalism. And that's an awful lot of humble pie for one man to eat, however much he enjoys a bacon sandwich. I think he would say, do you know what? I see the reform. I've got the memo. I understand the importance of growth. I understand the threat from Reform UK and from Nigel Farage. I am more aligned with the Prime Minister than my critics think. Nonetheless, there are going to be very serious cabinet tensions.
Many of the problems Labour are facing are sort of beyond its control, though, aren't they? You've got enormous instability in the world. We talked about Ukraine already today. The economic outlook isn't great. Is a change in direction to the right, to put it very crudely, is that actually going to help anything?
If we put aside left and right, because I'm no longer quite clear what they mean these days, I think we can agree that there is a huge part of the British electorate who have just had it up to the eyeballs with all politics, all politicians. They no longer believe that the Tories or Labour or the Westminster world answers their needs at all, and they're very, very likely to turn to an insurgent, either not vote or turn to an insurgent party, reform. That is the world that everybody's living in at the moment. And therefore, if you turn the question round and say, is it a sensible thing? Is it a shrewd thing for a Labour government to think very hard about the concerns of people who feel there isn't enough housing in the country, and that's partly due to huge mass immigration, particularly under Boris Johnson, but generally, and who are really, really worried about the rise of crime and just don't see things around them changing, then I think that's a very sensible thing for them to do. The really big problem for Keir Starmer is at what point does this big reformation, this big counter-revolutionary change in the Labour Party in government shift from being a shrewd, sensible reading of the new political weather and become a craven adoption of policies and a worldview emanating from Trump's White House that most British people loathe.
Well, there I guess we bring in Blue Labour, started by the Labour peer Maurice Glassman, who's obviously been very outspoken this week. But look, it's back in the headlines, isn't it? I mean, just for people who might not know, how would you sum it up?
It's very hard to sum up Blue Labour because it goes back a long time historically. I think it originates from something I think is virtuous and true, which is that in the modern world, the idea of the Labour Party has been very much an electoral Westminster kind of thing. And actually, if you look at its origins, the Labour Party, like many progressive movements around the world, grew out of religious, trade union, friendly society groups, all based in communities. In other words, it grew out of communities. All those people who were in their communities doing something for the people around them, so-called communitarianism. And there was an organisation called Citizens UK in this country, very, very important and influential in the 1980s and 1990s. And they said, if you're going to organise people, if people are going to be more self-confident, more powerful, then you have to start with their communities. You have to go to where people actually still gather together. It could be schools. Very often it's mosques and it's Hindu temples and it's synagogues and it's churches. So you don't push away, as it were, faith. That's where people gather. And that's where an awful lot of the Blue Labour thinking, I think, starts. And that's why there is an instinctive dislike of the kind of metropolitan, hyper-liberal disdain for religion and disdain for faraway communities. Starts from there, and then it says, well, in this world where Trump's in the White House, and Maurice Glassman, of course, is the only senior Labour figure to be invited to the inauguration by his mate, J.D. Vance, the Vice President, met the President, all of that. In this new world, that also involves thinking much, much harder about the interests, the worries and the fears of white working class and lower middle class voters around the country and people living a long way away from London. In a sense, it is the Labour answer to the Tories' interest in levelling up.
But how can we explain the difference, though? Because as you say, it's a Labour vision. How does it differ to a Trumpian vision in terms of, left-wing ideals, if you like?
It's much more interested in the role of the state in economics. It is not a free market, globalist, classical liberal libertarian view at all. It's much more about a kind of hard-edged realpolitik view of the state. Very important for the state to protect our industries, to protect our steel industry, to protect jobs here. So it's much more, as it were, left-wing than Trumpianism. Though, of course, in Trump's White House, there are lots of different strands of view, all already competing for attention. So I think, and it's quite socially conservative on social measures around sexuality and gender and all of that, because a lot of working class people are.
Well, a lot of the country, as it would seem, from polling this week as well, particularly on issues of gender. But
absolutely.
At the moment, it's a relatively small grouping. Well, only 4 or 5 people have put their names to it. How successful do you think Blue Labour can be as we go through 2025?
I think in terms of the taxonomy of Blue Labour, it's quite complicated. There's a group of MPs, a very small group at the moment, very much connected to a group of peers and Labour thinkers outside Parliament, which would be the core of Blue Labour. And they are, as it were, the philosophers of all of this. But beyond that, there's a much, much bigger group called the Red Wall Caucus, led by, you were talking about women, led by a woman, Jo White, which is Labour MPs who are in Red Wall seats, who are facing reform as their most immediate and proximate threat and want a much more popular, not populist, but popular emphasis from the government on day-to-day life. And they're very influential. And they're influential partly because people like Morgan McSweeney in Number 10, and I think Keir Starmer himself, are listening to them. They have friends at court. And so it's not just the numbers inside the Parliamentary Labour Party who would identify as Blue Labour. And Maurice Glassman's
rather McSweeney as one of our own, didn't they?
One of our own. Who would describe, but his kind of fruity comments about Richard Hermer and so on shows why some Labour MPs are a little shy of associating themselves publicly with him. So it's quite a small but influential group. Then around that is the Red Wall Caucus. But I am afraid more generally, as it becomes clearer that this is the way the government is going, and my piece today absolutely says this is where the government is going, frankly, careerism will kick in and lots of people will discover that they were Blue Labour or they were Red Wall caucus all along.
Are they pretty much the same? Are we going to end up with purple Labour wall?
Purple Labour wall. That's a really, really horrible, unforgivable description. So no, we're not.
Okay. but do they basically stand for the same thing, these two
Very
groupings?
similar things. I think the Blue Labour group has got, as it were, quite deep sort of philosophical roots in things like friendly societies, in the history of the Labour Party, is particularly interested in industrial strategy, and is particularly critical of the way that Rachel Reeves is running the economy at this moment. The Red Wall group are a bit softer, a bit gentler, but they have the same fears and the same electoral fears in particular.
Did you know that the New Statesman publishes the best reporting and analysis every day on our website, newstatesman.com, and in our weekly magazine? And we would love to welcome you as a subscriber. We are running a special offer right now for you, our viewers on YouTube. You can get your first 5 weeks for just £5 by heading to the link newstatesman.com/Feb25. Subscribers get full access to all our brilliant writing from people you'll know from this channel, like Andrew Marr, George Eaton, Rachel Cunliffe, and me, as well as some of the world's best writers, journalists and thinkers. Subscribe now at newstatesman.com/Feb25. The link is in the description below.